topic rather provocatively, I would admit, is why the new digital SAT is likely to be a disaster, and why you should almost certainly take the current version. Of course, if you can, if you're in a position to do so. And I am Chris Hamilton. I have founded several educational companies. The latest in the last 9 years is Hamilton Education. Many years before that, I taught English at UCLA. I enjoyed that tremendously. I taught 18th and 19th century British, and to make a living, to live through the summers, I began teaching the SAT and ACT and helping kids apply to college. And because there are no jobs, virtually none, for people with graduate degrees in 18th and 19th century British, I had to kind of build my own job. And to do that job today, I'm going to share some opinions, which you are welcome to take issue with, to lob critiques my way. At the end, I'll review questions that you submit over chat, and I will do my best to try to candidly answer them. The College Board, the nonprofit that creates the SAT, intends to release a digital SAT in March 2024. So that means if you are a 10th grader right now and you are planning on studying the SAT during the summer is a better time to study than almost any other time, because you get more sleep and you're more focused and have fewer obligations. The SAT that you would take in the fall would be the old SAT, the one that's been in place since 2016. It won't be until 2024 the College Board intends to release a new digital test, which is really quite a departure in many ways from the traditional test. You should keep in mind, in almost every instance that College Board has given a hard date when they're going to release something, they've missed that date by almost a year. It could be they'll meet their deadline this time, but if past practice is any indication, it might be somewhat delayed. The test is going to be adaptive. This is a word that means how you perform on the first half of the test, reading or in math, will determine what questions you get in the second half. This is already something practiced on the GRE, the graduate record exam. There are many reasons I'm going to argue that you should be skeptical of this test. But since the 2005 SAT, rather, I should say, the SAT was the same for many, many decades. It was virtually unchanged. In the mid-1990s, College Board did what they call a recentering of the test. They basically were reacting to the fact that by the mid-90s, general literacy had declined. So they just scaled the test to make it easier. So old people like myself who took the test in the 1980s, or even older people than I am, it took it in the 70s. The test was actually harder test. But starting in 2005, there were lots of changes introduced. 2005 brought a new SAT that had a writing section as well as a reading section and the math section, and the scale was out of 2400. This was in response to criticisms by Chancellor Atkinson of the UC system. And that test eventually gave way in 2016 to a new SAT, which will soon be the old SAT. So for many, many decades, the SAT was virtually unchanged. And then about every 7 or 8 years, there's been a major revision to the test. This newest test, the digital test, I'm going to call it a TikTok test. It is essentially meant for a generation of students who read and write primarily on their phones. When they say a digital test, they're not fooling around. This is a test meant to be taken on a screen. This has introduced some very important changes to the essence of the SAT. For example, the classic SAT offered what were called passages, 850 word essays or pieces of fiction that had a dozen questions associated with them. So here's a typical example. I'm not going to make you guys take this tonight, but I occasionally hear criticisms of the SAT like, oh, the SAT is really boring. Okay, maybe I'm a little biased, but I don't think so. This is from a test that was given in 2005. This is the opening chapter, the opening moments of the extraordinary novel Deliverance by James Dickey, turned into a movie that has an almost cult-like following. And it's pretty typical of what kind of literature you might see on the SAT. It begins, it unrolled slowly, forced to show its colors, curling and snapping back whenever one of us turned loose. You've got to read an opening of a novel where eventually you're going to figure out who the characters are. But the first question says, in lines, blah, 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 the map is described. Well, you might not have even realized that it is a map. And you'd have to know, oh, it's probably described as animate because it's as if it's alive. The whole land was very tense. If you look at the last bit of this passage, you've got to kind of hear some voices in your head, not crazy voices, the voices of the speakers. They tell me that this is the kind of thing that gets hold of middle-class householders every once in a while, Bobby said, but most of them just lie down till the feeling passes. They're talking about going on a canoe trip, going on a river trip. These are middle-aged guys going to go on some kind of adventure. And one of them makes the joke, oh yeah, this is the kind of thing that apparently gets hold of middle-aged guys. They want to have adventure, but most of them just lie down till the feeling passes, which is sort of an allusion to advice a doctor might have given in the 50s to a person experiencing menopausal hot flashes. That's sort of his joke. And another character says, and when most of them lie down, they're at Woodlawn before they think about getting up, Lewis said. This is a passage that you can teach. You could teach it in a college class. I have run into passages on the older SAT where I would literally sign up and take the actual test in a high school. Occasionally, students would look at me funny back then and ask, like, do you somehow go to our school? I definitely do not. I remember reading, getting excited about reading the opening chapter to Brian Greene's extraordinary, The Elegant Universe, reading something and recognizing, this is from Dickens' Great Expectations. Students struggled with things like this. If you read a lot, if you were a really obsessive reader, this would also be fun for you. And when you are older, when you're in your 20s and you simply have read more, most of this wouldn't be very challenging. But this is something that students could see was, potentially a little bit challenging. So to teach this, which is something that I've done for many decades, you've got to teach rhetoric. You've got to teach how arguments are made. If it's a nonfiction piece, you've got to teach voice and tone. I would tell students, half jokingly, you should hear voices in your head when you read. And I would explain not voices that tell you to burn things, but you should hear the tone, the voice, the commitment. You've got to have strong working memory to navigate passages that are long. You got to remember what was happening in the opening. You've often got to understand arguments that are counterintuitive or that are nuanced. I'm going to make an argument here. I hope it's not too controversial. Understanding nuance, understanding how arguments are not one-dimensional, how an author might tackle a topic where they have mixed feelings about it, where there might be more than one side, is not just useful as an intellectual exercise, it's also a useful moral exercise. This is why I gained so much pleasure teaching literature to college students. Now, the new digital SAT, my office, we've all been looking through the examples College Board has provided. It's an extraordinary departure from the traditional model of the SAT. It has essentially no passages. The new digital SAT will have no reading passages. It will offer single paragraphs that are accompanied by a single question. So this is now what the SAT is going to use to measure reading. A fairly brief paragraph and a single question. Some of you might think, well, then the test will be easier. We will talk in a moment about why that's almost certainly not the case. It will certainly be less rewarding to teach. Speaking of teaching, since I taught hundreds of students at UCLA, I don't remember ever assigning a single paragraph. So as you can probably tell, one of my worries about the new test is whether colleges will see it as a meaningful measure of how well you would do in a college environment. Clearly, this new SAT is meant for a generation of students who read and write primarily on their phones. I have many concerns with this new test, how to teach it, for instance. I'm very proud that we've had so many students do well over the years. It's largely because when students come into summer SAT, ACT classes, we start out, at least on the reading end, teaching them how to read, how to think, how to be a critical reader rather than how to take a test. And students leave and often go off to Ivy League schools with a skill set that they wouldn't have had if they hadn't been in our classroom. They look at a piece of writing and can say, that's a classic proleptic opening, or this is a good example of structural irony. My students, when they go off to fancy schools, they're never behind in math and science if they went to CCA or Westview or really strong STEM-related high schools. But it's really in my class where they're learning some of the things that they would get if they were in a boarding school in a class of 12, learning how to read in a very critical and analytical way. My primary concern, though, is that the new SAT may render some of the long-standing and largely facile and weak arguments against the SAT, arguments that it's irrelevant. The new SAT may give those arguments a little greater merit than they should have. So to understand the situation a little bit better, I want to just briefly talk about the recent history of the SAT. This gentleman on the slide is David Coleman. He's the CEO of College Board. And at a NACAT conference in Toronto in 2013, I was at that conference along with some of my staff. David Coleman kind of shocked the audience in announcing, we're committed to a redesigned SAT. It'll be more open and clear than any in our history, which strongly suggests that he's acknowledging that somehow the earlier SATs, the one that you just saw when I first read that passage from Deliverance, that was somehow not open and clear. He says, an improved SAT that will strongly focus on the core knowledge and skills that evidence shows are most important to prepare students, blah, 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 easier for students to navigate this territory. And then he went on and described some of the new elements of the new SAT. And as I told you, I was in the audience. And when he described the new SAT, it was going to have this and this and this. I made my way to the microphone so I could ask a question. And you can actually see my question here. A magazine called Inside Higher Ed wrote a story about this conference. And I'll just read this quote. One questioner suggested that Coleman was describing a test more like the ACT, which has long claimed that it is more curricularly based than the SAT. And the ACT has gained substantially against the SAT in recent years in market share. One questioner here inside Higher Education reported, warning the audience to prepare to be shocked, said that he liked the current SAT and feared the new SAT might be something like New Coke. All right, in case you're not in your 50s or you didn't grow up in the 80s or you haven't seen Stranger Things, I want to explain what in the world New Coke is. In the 1980s, Pepsi began marketing Pepsi with a kind of taste test. They called it the Pepsi Challenge. They would offer you two little cups, Dixie cups or plastic cups of soda, and the bottles were hidden, and you were asked which one you prefer. This is marketing genius because Pepsi is lower acid and sweeter than Coke. And so almost anyone who studies organoleptics, the science of taste, would tell you people in a sip are going to prefer something sweeter. We're bioevolutionarily programmed. Over the course of a meal, maybe with a greasy hamburger and fries, probably a more acidic, less sweet beverage like Coca-Cola would be better. But the Pepsi Challenge, cleverly on the part of Pepsi, revealed that in this quick sip, more people preferred the taste of Pepsi. And the analogy here is that in the late 90s and early 2000s, more and more students were going into Barnes and Noble. It's a bookstore. Some of you remember books. And they would look at the two versions of the classic tests, the SAT and ACT, and they would glance through them just like a taste test and notice that the ACT didn't have any vocabulary, didn't have 19 questions devoted to vocabulary, and it appeared to be easier. That's not actually the case. We'll talk about why the ACT is not really easier. But shockingly, Coca-Cola seems to be the only group of people in the world that were convinced that more people like Pepsi. Coke dominated the market, but in reaction to this marketing scheme by Pepsi, Coca-Cola literally changed the formula of Coke, and they came up with something called New Coke. It tasted like Pepsi. As any business professor will tell you, this was one of the most spectacular failures in the 20th century of modern business. New Coke was an extraordinary failure. So my question was to David Coleman, are you worried in making a test that's uncannily like the ACT that you're making New Coke? He dismissed that. He didn't like the question. But I'm going to argue that today we know, yes, David Coleman made New Coke. The old SAT, the classic SAT, had a lot of vocabulary. Any kid could look at that and see that was difficult. David Coleman said the new SAT would not ask questions about irrelevant, esoteric words. And in fact, I'm just going to basically quote him here. In the new Blue Book, the new test prep book that was released for the 2016 SAT, which is like New Coke, he said, we're going to eliminate obscure words from the SAT. We're going to test the things that matter. And then here's his example. He said in the materials for College Board, take the word husband. Most people think of a husband as a marriage partner, but husband can also be used as a verb that means to carefully or in a limited way, blah, blah, blah. He says, note that husband in the use carefully sense might show up in practically any kind of text, making this word and this meaning valuable to know. So first of all, it's worth noting that Coleman, in his pledge to avoid esoteric words, used the word esoteric, a word that he apparently found useful. But the next year at NACAC, I asked College Board folks about this ridiculous claim that somehow in eliminating vocabulary from the SAT, clearly because students didn't like it and they were shifting to the ACT, that in inserting a word like husband, in a sentence, this would somehow be measuring a word that could be found in any context. I actually, at the conference, turned around to this group of 600 people, most of whom were college admissions people, and asked if anyone in this audience had used the word husband to mean carefully or cautiously limiting something in the last year. And one person raised their hand. And then I added, one person who's used it in the last year who isn't a writer for Downton Abbey. And then the person, understanding my joke, pulled their hand down. I was suggesting this is an outrageous claim. The word husband is not an everyday word. It's a very esoteric word. Back then, 2013, I was realizing that the SAT was changing its flavor, changing its formula, changing a reasoning test that was used to admit people historically to Harvard and Stanford into more of an achievement test. Culturally, there was a shift toward that model. What that means is that the ACT was originally designed not to figure out who's in the top 1%, but to just answer the question, who has a basic fundamental set of skills applicable to college? The ACT was originally created in 1959 to admit people to the University of Iowa, and it was a very basic kind of test. What's not well known is that to become a national exam, the ACT had to do something that would allow it to produce a Gaussian or normal distribution curve. So when the SAT said they're going to get rid of vocabulary, words that no one would use, I heard a lot of teachers and counselors say things like, oh, now the SAT is going to be easier because, you're not going to have to learn vocabulary. These claims never made sense to me. They suggest a deep misunderstanding of how standardized tests actually work. Standardized tests like the SAT and ACT are not like a test at the DMV. At the DMV, there are standards. You have to be able to do this, this, this. You have to know this and this. If everyone knows those things, everyone gets their license. I have never been at the DMV and seen anything like a ceremony for valedictorian of the DMV. You don't discover that you got an A or an A+. You have the skills or you do not have the skills. The ACT used to be that kind of test. To turn the ACT into a test that would produce this, that would produce a Gaussian or normal distribution curve, the ACT many decades ago introduced speed. The ACT sped up the test. So the ACT, I can confidently tell you, it tends to favor students who are among the first to be done, or it favors students in honors and AP classes who have long been pretty fast in terms of a lot of cognitive skills. The argument that taking away vocabulary from the SAT would make it easier is a nonsensical argument because the test is still going to have 1% down at the 1% portion of the bell curve. It might be easier for some people who don't have vocabulary but have other skills. By the way, the current SAT, the one that was introduced in 2016, it took away vocab, but it added 18th and 19th century passages, which almost every student found difficult. And that was how they guaranteed that they would get a Gaussian or normal distribution curve. Realizing that this new SAT was very, very similar to the ACT. By the way, there were rumors at that NACAT conference in 2013 that turned out to be largely true, that David Coleman had plucked 13 ACT test developers from the ACT Corporation and given them jobs at the SAT. Why would you do that? I had a theory. He did that because he wanted the new SAT to be very similar to the ACT. He made New Coke. We adapted to the changes, and I offered classes that would teach the SAT and ACT side by side so students could see that they are similar. Around 2015, there were 5 local kids in San Diego County who earned a perfect ACT score in 2015. There were 5. You can see them here in the news. 2 of them are Westview students, by the way. And if you look at this newspaper from Omaha, In a year, in the entire state of Nebraska, 17 students got perfect SAT or ACT scores. So I thought, we should probably be teaching these two tests together now that the SAT is similar. I thought other companies would follow suit. It turned out no one did. We ended up producing outrageous numbers of perfect scores. In 2016, we had something like 43 kids get perfect ACT scores. What I realized was that the ACT, because it was meant originally for a population in Iowa to determine if they were ready for the University of Iowa, it was less sensitive at the edge of the scale, and it was easier, therefore, not easier to do well on, but easier to be perfect. We had 43 kids get perfect scores in 2016. But the new SAT, like a struggling restaurant, is changing the topic or concept yet again, hoping that its digital format will click with students. Who knows? It might. I'm worried that it may not click with colleges and universities, because if colleges and universities take a careful look at what this test is measuring, it is measuring what students would read on their phones and not what they would read in classrooms. And remember, the test is not going to be easier because it's still got to produce a Gaussian curve. There's got to be something that makes this test tricky. Rather than asking students to comprehend nuanced arguments, which is obviously something challenging for most students, the new digital SAT, because it is digital, it introduces difficulty in ways that are less straightforward and, I would argue, somewhat sneaky. In fact, the ACT is a little sneaky. It looks very, very simple. The passages are easier generally than the SAT, but you don't have enough time. If you're wired quickly, which is, by the way, more of an innate thing rather than something you can learn, you're at an advantage on the ACT. This is precisely why I incorporated it into our program. So here's an example of the new SAT. First of all, there's a paragraph of text and a graph, and then there are 4 questions. So, I mean, I'm not going to check your answers, but I want you to take a look at this graph and a look at this question. Considering a large sample of companies, economics experts Maria Guadalupe, Julia Wolf, and Raghuram Rajan assess the number of managers and leaders from different departments who reported directly to a chief executive officer. First of all, that's unbelievably dry and boring. This is not people on a canoe trip or reading about string theory. This is like a corporate meeting. According to the researchers, the findings suggest that across the years analyzed, there was a growing interest among CEOs in connecting with more departments in their companies. Okay, that's it. This is one entire reading passage, which is a paragraph. And then they ask you, which choice best describes the data that supports the researcher's conclusion? I'm going to ask you to just skip down to C and D. Look at C. The average number of department leaders. Okay, department leaders, that's the dark gray bar in the histogram, reporting directly to their CEO is greater than the average number of managers reporting directly to their CEO in each of the 3 periods. Okay, that looks true. You'd be very tempted to put that. And that would be wrong. Now, it's wrong because if you look at the question, it says, or rather, you look at the passage, which is one paragraph. It says there was a growing interest among CEOs in connecting with more departments. Now, C is true. The average number of department leaders reporting directly to the CEO is greater than the average number of managers reporting in each of the 3 periods. But that isn't really part of the researcher's conclusion. It was that there was a growing interest. And so the answer would be D, the average number of department leaders reporting directly to the CEO rose over the 3 periods studied. This type of question I find incredibly annoying and not tremendously helpful in understanding whether a student is a good reader. It reminds me a little bit of a trick someone played on me when I was in the 1st grade. Maybe none of you had a mean-spirited neighbor like I did, but In the first grade, my neighbor asked me this question. He said, okay, you're the bus driver. And then he went through a long litany. 7 people get on the bus at the first stop. Okay, I'm 7. And 3 more get on at the second stop. But at the third stop, 4 get off and 2 more get on. And this went on for a few more iterations. And I'm keeping a running tally of how many people are on the bus. And then my second grade, slightly bullyish neighbor says, okay, are you ready? And I already have a number in my head. He says, who's the bus driver? And, I'm a first grader. I said, I don't know who the bus driver is. I can tell you how many people on the bus. He goes, no, you're the bus driver. I told you that at the beginning. That's the essence of the question I just showed you. Instead of asking meaningful questions about grammar, which is currently quite contentious, particularly pronouns, the test now focuses mostly on punctuation, which many of you know is different in the US compared to the rest of the English-speaking world. In England, this question would make no sense. In any country associated with England in the last 100 years, the answer for 25 is C, because in the American tradition, the punctuation goes inside a quote. In every other English-speaking nation, it would go outside. That's worth knowing. I correct it on college essays, but it doesn't seem like a very meaningful thing to ask in terms of grammar. Vocabulary, which David Coleman said was unimportant. It was just, something irrelevant to everyday life. Vocabulary has come roaring back in the new test. So the new test has a bunch of questions like this. Personally, I think vocabulary is a very useful thing to understand. I've seen over many years students tell me, oh, I got to learn these vocab words. And then they tell me when they're 22 or 23, these words that I thought were SAT words, they're just like words. For instance, in this rather long sentence, because we see the accessory spleen may actively support diving mechanisms, it isn't going to be latent. So this is useful to know. The new SAT is going to reward students who are learning vocabulary in a formal way. So, no secret, we're going to be returning to emphasizing learning vocabulary in preparing people for this new test. The math portion of the new digital SAT offers fewer changes, largely because the math questions require a less radical change to fit onto a digital screen. What I'm telling you is the SAT's questions have been shifted or shaped so they can fit on a screen. It's almost certainly true that it would be useful to measure if students can understand an argument over 800 or 900 words from a scientific journal or the introduction to a Neil deGrasse Tyson book, but you can't fit something like that onto a single screen. So those things are gone. I admit it, I'm a little biased, but I tend to think being able to read arguments that are made over multiple paragraphs, being able to read an argument that shifts and moves and is nuanced is really useful in knowing how you'll do in college. There are some hints that even the math section, though, is using some sort of sneaky, tricky elements to introduce difficulty, like using really large percentages that throw some students off. In fact, it's precisely the digital aspect of the SAT that's prompted these changes. The SAT is paradoxically competing with the ACT to be perceived as easier. And certainly College Board thinks, okay, in this battle between the SAT and ACT, if we go digital, if we have no reading passages, maybe we will go back to being the test of choice, because the ACT nationally is now the test of choice, and it has been for almost 10 years. And I would have to admit, if you liked learning on a screen during COVID, if you feel that online learning is superior to in-person learning, then the new digital SAT may be a good fit. We are certainly going to offer preparation for this test, but there are some larger cultural differences to be worried about, I would argue, regarding this new test. This is a very famous scholar named Marshall McLuhan, and he is known for the phrase, "the medium is the message." This, to translate it into ordinary people talk, means that the medium in which you learn something isn't transparent. It doesn't have zero effect on how you learn. If you learn largely on a television, you are building a different sort of brain than if you learn largely through books. I have to admit, thousands of years ago, Greek scholars argued that books would make people stupid because we're not going to memorize and speak with the same confidence. And probably by that standard, that turned out to be true. Marshall McLuhan was worried about TV screens and suggesting it would change what could be learned. I would argue there are some very important psychologists and scientists who have made similar claims about these screens. The new test has conceded that this is how we're going to interact with the world. But that medium, a screen, allows certain kinds of thinking and makes very difficult other types of thinking. In many ways, the new digital SAT is desperately trying to overcome criticisms of standardized testing that have been debunked and demolished, but that just won't die. David Coleman, in talking about making the test in 2016, the new one, which will soon be the old one, more open, he's trying to basically placate a number of arguments that people have made that somehow the SAT is unfair. I'm going to call these zombie ideas. In other words, no matter what, they just won't die. If I ask students, which I do frequently, about the UC study of the SAT and ACT, 95% of the people I ask tell me, oh, that study concluded that the SAT was not useful in predicting success, that it was unfair, that it only measures wealth, and, you should get rid of it. The study concluded the opposite. In fact, the argument, which I hear on NPR all the time, that grades are a better predictor of success is almost nonsensical, not only because it's contradicted by this 2-year-long, extraordinarily detailed report, but when so many people have perfect grades, how in the world are you going to use grades to distinguish who gets into selective colleges? When we know that some high schools have a very rigorous grading regime and others have what's now called equitable grading regimes, which means no one should get bad grades. The idea that grades will be the primary factor is, to be certain, is a bit disingenuous. Here are a couple zombie ideas. The SAT doesn't measure anything important. Empirical evidence suggests it certainly does. The SAT only measures wealth. MIT and Purdue are going back to requiring the test of all applicants because the SAT and ACT are uncanny in locating students who have been under-resourced, underprivileged, but who perform despite those challenges. The SAT is racist and sexist. This argument simply suggests wherever there is a gap, the SAT must be the cause of it. Almost every serious sociologist agrees the SAT is measuring gaps, not creating them. I hear this one a lot. It's not fair that anyone would be judged by a single number. Here's Columbia repeating this idea. When they are talking about being test optional, they're saying, we believe that no one can be defined by any single factor. What Columbia is not telling you is they have long believed this. When they made the SAT and ACT absolute requirements, they didn't let people in just based on their SAT. They wouldn't kick people out or reject them based solely on their SAT. This is a what we call a straw man argument. This is an argument you make up just to knock down, but it's not a fair argument. One complaint that I've heard at conferences and heard over many years, which is utterly baffling to me, is that the SAT is coachable. Someone who's part of an anti-SAT, ACT nonprofit named Robert Schaefer, he will stand up and argue vociferously that these tests are coachable. I want you to think about what it means to argue that the SAT and ACT are unfair or a problem because they are coachable. This person, Carol Dweck, is famous for a book called Mindset and a concept called the growth mindset. The fixed mindset suggests you're just not good at stuff. Don't bother. Don't try. That's just not your thing. The growth mindset says, I'm not good at this now, but if I work on it and I practice, I could be better. I would argue there's a cultural battle taking place in college and high school campuses where most of my students have families who, they may not use this term, growth mindset, but that is what they believe. They believe if you work hard, if you put in effort, that can overcome a lack of innate ability. It can overcome initial challenges. To argue that the SAT and ACT are coachable and therefore the tests are illegitimate is to fail to recognize there's nothing worth doing that is not coachable. Math is coachable. Basketball is coachable. Music is coachable. Reading and writing are coachable. I know this because we have all, at some point in our lives, been taught to read and write and do math. I can tell you what's not coachable. Color of your eyes, your height, the color of your skin is not coachable. The UCs, as many of you know, in this report came to the conclusion that they should not go test optional. The UC study discovered that the use of the SAT was very, very beneficial. And as all of you, I think, know, the UCs decided to simply get rid of the SAT and ACT. But what this means is, of course, the UCs got rid of the SAT and ACT because they want to make a different kind of decision about what students they're admitting. What that means for all of you is that you have to expand your list to colleges, especially if you want to study computer science or engineering, to colleges that are often not in the UC or Cal State system. And these colleges are very adamantly in favor of test scores, especially for majors that are impacted and technical, like computer science and engineering. You must apply to these colleges, and they either require or strongly suggest that you use these tests. In my view, the new digital SAT, it smells like desperation. It's David Coleman's attempt to placate and appease critics of testing and merit-driven college admissions. I don't think it's a winning strategy. I think Coleman should be defending, as the CEO of College Board, the well-documented positive role of standardized testing as a social and economic ladder for immigrant students. As I've shared with some of you in other webinars and other venues, it's well documented by historians and sociologists that holistic admission in the 50s and 60s and Ivies was almost entirely created because there were too many of one immigrant group. In the 50s and 60s, it was Eastern Europeans who tended to be Jewish. Coleman is trying to come up with a test that will make the critics of the SAT and merit-driven admission happy. And these critics think that it's not Eastern European immigrants who are too present, but in most cases, Asian American and Middle Eastern immigrants who have a growth mindset, who believe it's important to try, who believe that although there may be structural forces working against you, you have agency and you can overcome. This is a picture of Neville Chamberlain and a very famous German statesman. I would argue that David Coleman, certainly, I'm not saying he's a Nazi. I'm saying he's the Neville Chamberlain of education. Neville Chamberlain is famous as the Prime Minister of England. He's famous for a policy called appeasement, hoping that if we would just give Hitler and Germany Czechoslovakia, this would appease the German hunt for Lebensraum, for living room, for expansion. But of course, it didn't. Germany took Poland and then France and then attempted to take all of Europe. David Coleman is trying to find a test that will make the critics of standardized testing and merit-driven admission happy. He is not going to find a test because those forces do not believe in measuring things in that way, and they don't believe, honestly, in the growth mindset, honestly. They believe in restructuring almost by fiat the demographics, certainly of the UC system and other colleges. College Board, in my opinion, should do what Coca-Cola did in the 1980s. Coca-Cola quietly killed off New Coke and went back to what they called Coke Classic. The data about the efficacy of the tests, which is very compelling, is based on earlier tests. It's unclear to me whether the new tests will be able to make the same claims. There's going to be no data on these new tests, not for a long time. And looking at the tests, I confess, I'm worried and skeptical. There's a kind of race to the bottom, and College Board is winning that race. I would argue the earlier iterations of the SAT going back to the 1990s or the 2005, 2010 version are better mechanisms for helping us understand student skills across many different areas. It's unclear to me whether colleges will find this test useful. It troubles me that colleges may, in fact, look at the new test and say, see, this is what we've been saying. Probably College Board should consider creating Coke Classic, and we'll see what happens. So what should you do? What should students do? There's just a few simple things you should consider. I recommend, if you have a choice, that you take the current SAT, obviously. It's a known entity, and it's 95% concordant, a fancy word for aligning with or similar to the ACT. So if you can study this summer, that would be better than studying next summer, because if you study next summer, you're studying for two tests that don't align anywhere like the way they do now. The SAT and ACT is an example of two birds, one stone. We are exploiting, using the current SAT, the fact that the current SAT is very sensitive at the far edge of the scale. If you miss a little bit based on certain core skills, you won't get a perfect score. You'll get a 1570, 1580, 1590. The ACT is testing exactly the same skills, but it's scaled based on an earlier test from Iowa, and it's less interested in the edge of the scale. It tends to round up to a perfect 36, even if you make one or two errors in different sections. Why do I want people currently to study both? Well, because of the similarities, but also because the PSAT is a good reason to not only focus on the ACT. Some advice I'm giving that's a little different than in the past. In the past, if you were a ninth grader and you were racing ahead, you were already jumping into Calc AB in the 10th grade, then I might say, hey, let's consider studying the SAT, ACT in the summer between 9th and 10th grade, because in the 10th grade, when you do calculus, there's no calculus on the SAT or ACT, not even a drop of it. So you're really racing past the material being tested. That would happen occasionally. This year, I'm taking another look at it, and I'm going to suggest that 9th graders going into 10th grade, they may want to study the SAT or ACT or both this summer, because IM2, IM3 is really the highest level of math on the SAT, ACT. They're not going to gain much if they are going into calc in the 10th grade, but they may have an opportunity to take a test that we know and colleges know is effective. If you wait and take the new test, it may be that it will feel easier to you, but I want to remind you, if you're a good reader, you're going to have to retrain yourself to read like a lawyer, to read looking for sneaky, tricky elements. I've been proud to tell people, you don't have to be sneaky and tricky. You just need to understand nuanced, difficult arguments and texts. There are no nuanced, difficult arguments or texts in the new SAT because there's hardly any reading in it. It is paragraphs. It is something that you could and maybe someday will read on your phone. I would argue that the new test suggests that 7th, 8th, and 9th graders should be studying vocabulary. If the new test becomes the SAT, you're going to need vocabulary. We used to kind of de-emphasize in the last 5 or 6 years vocabulary because the test de-emphasized it. Why is the SAT going back to focusing on vocab, even though David Coleman said that wasn't important? Well, vocabulary is a simple way to introduce challenging items. This is a fancy psychographic test prep word for a question. You need hard questions to produce a normal distribution curve. It's very easy to just throw a couple difficult words at people. The question I showed you, latent, most high school students will be unfamiliar with that word. And questions that are in a single sentence about vocabulary, they fit easily on a screen. That is why the SAT has gone back to vocabulary. There's little doubt that taking these tests is advantageous in whatever form. The data is overwhelming. Studies from the early cycle of test optional suggested that students who submitted scores to test optional schools above the 25th percentile were accepted at double the rate of those who didn't submit scores. What's more interesting, even students who submitted scores below the 25th percentile were accepted at a greater rate than students who did not submit test scores. A piece of advice that's perfectly rational but not empirically correct is submit scores if the scores are going to show that you're, above the average. I understand why people would say that. It makes rational, logical sense. But empirically, even submitting scores that are not by the standard of the institution great scores apparently adds some value, most likely because even if the score is not impressive, at least they know it's not terrible. If you go to a very competitive, rigorous school rather than a equitable grading school, you may be disappointed with your scores. You may think they're not good. I've had students get into Harvard, Yale, and Stanford submitting scores that they thought weren't good because they weren't as good as their older brother's scores. They weren't as good as someone else at their school. But I want them to keep in mind, colleges don't look at the scores as a single number. They really are looking in a holistic way. Emory discovered that kids who submitted test scores had a clear advantage. About half of Emory's applicants submitted scores, but of those admitted, it was nearly 70%. Almost everyone agrees if you're from a middle class or competitive high school, you really should be taking scores. Preliminary data from other Ivy Leagues and Stanford suggest that around 70% of admitted students had taken the test and included a score on their application. And in our office in the last 3 years, with over 100 students in those last couple of years getting into schools like Stanford and Yale and Harvard, I can't produce one example of a student who is accepted without submitting scores. I know there are some out there. They're just not coming from high schools in San Diego. I want to ask you to consider, in thinking about what's happening with the diminishment of standardized testing and the move away from merit, I want you to consider a historical analogy that might seem out of left field, but I think is actually quite in the center of things. I read a book more than a decade ago called Last Call. It's a history of prohibition. As many of you know, the Volstead Act, prohibition, was a federal law that prohibited the consumption and sale of alcohol. Reading this book, I learned there was a strong element of anti-immigrant rhetoric and energy in the Volstead Act, in prohibition. It was immigrants recently arrived from Europe, from Germany, from Ireland, who drank beer. Italians drank wine. There was a moral certainty that if we could eliminate alcohol, we will eliminate all kinds of problems. And you got to consider, almost no one thought that prohibition would pass. It seemed outrageous, but it really passed. It became the law of the land for 13 years because it was very difficult to stand up and say that you were for something that could in any way be associated with drunkenness or domestic abuse. I mean, no one wants to be for those things. And so no one really stood up for common sense, which is Jesus turned water into wine. He didn't turn water into sparkling water. For many cultures, wine and beer are food. For many immigrant cultures, this is a part of who they are. After 13 years, prohibition, the Volstead Act was repealed, but it passed because no one really had the courage to stand up and say, look, we don't like abuse of alcohol, but there's some common sense here about the freedom to go to a restaurant and have a glass of wine, to drink a glass of wine in your home, to drink a beer. Prohibition destroyed the livelihood of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Americans, and invented essentially organized crime. It was a really classic example of good intentions and a terrible result. The analogy is the colleges and universities and even high schools that are interested in a equity-driven admission than a merit-driven admissions, their intentions are good. They want one version of diversity. I would simply point out that model of diversity doesn't include most of my students, many of whom were just a few generations back, British colonial subjects or colonized by some other force in the world and have come seeking education as a ladder. But currently, if you talk about merit, you appear to be in some way opposed to diversity. And so people are quiet. They don't want to raise their voice. There's just some common sense. Most colleges do want to know something about whether you can read, something about whether you understand grammar, your skill and facility with math up to Algebra 2. I strongly urge you to take these tests and study for these tests. And I would urge you, if you're deciding between the old one and the new one when it comes to the SAT, I'd lean toward taking the current one, the one that we know, rather than the one we don't know. Because I think when colleges get a closer look at it, some of the arguments that have had very little weight and force about whether this test is meaningless, they may become a little bit better of an argument when people see how thin some of the elements of the new SAT really are. We are preparing to teach it, and it may in the end be good for us. We'll certainly, if it's a digital test, be able to work in a more easy way with students all over the world. But I have my doubts about whether it's going to help colleges understand, are you ready to walk through the gates at Yale and thrive? Are you ready to sit in a classroom like the one I used to teach at UCLA and dig into texts that are challenging and nuanced, have many layers and levels of meaning? I'm going to take a look at some questions and do my best to answer them. Let me, rather than keeping them on the screen, let me unscreen share here. Okay. Unfortunately, now you have to look at my face. Yeah, the PSAT this year will be digital with no choice. We're going to be this summer offering students opportunities to work with the new PSAT. We're going to let students have some familiarity with it. And we're also going to be increasing the vocabulary that we give students to accommodate that. We are not going to, we're not going to ignore it. All right. Okay, I know, Eleanor. Punctuation question is interesting. Yeah. Okay, this person who I don't want to identify her. I hope I'm not sharing my screen. This person is a highly educated lawyer and points out a very relevant point. Some high schools teach British punctuation, and they may not be familiar with the difference and American styles. That is an excellent point. It's another reason why I'm worried that if colleges were to actually dig into this test, some of the arguments about the test's lack of force or meaning might suddenly be a little more filled with merit. Someone is asking what I suggest an 11th grader to take the August or October SAT. I usually suggest that people take the August if it's on the tail of some preparation, and sign up for the October SAT. A lot of people do better on the October SAT, not because it's easier, but because they're nervous on the August one and they get a chance to maybe do a little bit more practice and prep. There's no real difference between them. The August one is less likely to be influenced by homework, schoolwork, but October, we get a lot more perfect scores in October, largely because kids have a little more time to study it. Someone is asking if the ACT is going to be digital. The ACT people who run that, frankly, they're smarter. My guess is the ACT is going to watch and see what goes on. Yeah, I will share this webinar. We'll make a link available. For most ninth graders, if you've had enough of the math, if you've had up through IM2 or IM3, you have all the preparation you need to begin studying for the SAT. And that study would be teaching people to be careful readers, careful critical thinkers, giving students the current understanding of how grammar works, and making sure that they are understanding what math questions are actually asking. I would say I'm deciding whether ninth graders going into 10th should study this summer on a case-by-case basis. I'm looking at the maturity, and I'm looking at the math skills, and I'm looking at like a diagnostic score to see if they're really ready to approach this kind of prep. In the past, I've had ninth graders going into 10th grade who study, and some of the perfect scores that are on our nerdy list of perfect score students are students who studied in the summer between 9th and 10th grade. I am open to revising my opinions on the new SAT, but to me, it looks a little more gimmicky, and it looks like, as Marshall McLuhan famously said, the medium is the message. In this case, the medium is an online screen-based test, which, for reasons of those constraints, are going to be not engaging in the kind of subtle, interesting arguments and writing. I would not recommend eighth graders. Someone's asking about eighth graders. I probably wouldn't recommend eighth graders who've completed Math 2 do this. I think that's a little bit early. I'm also worried that a 10th grader taking the SAT is okay. A ninth grader taking the SAT, ACT will sometimes be read, often not correctly. It'll be read by colleges as having a parent who's helicoptering and pushing the student to do something. So I would probably say, one of the worst things you can do is give the impression to a selective college that you're a kind of pushy parent pushing a ninth grader. I would say ninth graders going into 10th is a very reasonable possibility. The most common of our students' schedules would be finishing 10th, going into 11th, the summer in between, doing some prep. I'm going to thank everyone for your time, of course, and thank you for your questions. I'm also going to remind everyone my email is ch, the letter C, the letter H, at hamiltoneducation.com. I'll do my best to answer questions in a more thorough or private way. Thank you for indulging me in this rant-esque webinar, and good night.